Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar today. Apologies for the lateness. So, this is the first Black History Month interview of 2025, and we are happy to be introducing Dr. Ron Mickens. So, Dr. Mickens is a mathematician and physicist born in 1943 who attended Fisk University for undergrad and did his PhD in theoretical physics in 1968 at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Mickens worked as a postdoctoral fellow at MIT through the Danforth and Woodrow Wilson Foundations and through the National Science Foundation. Dr. Mickens has had an illustrious career and now resides at Clark Atlanta University as a professor. So thanks so much for coming, Dr. Mickens.
Thank you very much. And you can call me Ron.
I'll
I
call you.
mean, before I got my PhD, I had published 11 papers. I noticed that my mama called me Ron, and I like that. So you can just call me Ron, and I'll
Okay,
call you Alan. Is that all right?
that's all right with me.
And
And
keep
then,
in mind, if the only reason you can get respect is because of your degree, then you haven't done much to deserve respect.
that's a good lesson to start off with. I appreciate that.
All righty.
So I had some questions for you, and so some of these are things that you might expect, and then I will ask some questions that that you've had time to think over. But
Well,
um
actually, I have not thought about any of it. I do much
okay,
better when I do
okay,
it cold, but I have been doing this stuff for 82 years, so
all right. I hope
I
so.
am ready.
Great, awesome. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about you growing up, where you grew up, and kind of what made you attracted to math and science to begin with?
Well, I grew up in Petersburg, Virginia, which is about 22 miles south of Richmond, Virginia. Uh, and when I was very young, probably around 3 years old, I started interacting very strongly with my grandfather. And he would teach me various games, board games, and he taught me how to play checkers, and he also allowed me to play checkers with the old men. And so after a year or two, I got to the point where I could beat them at playing checkers. But one of the things that he said to me continuously was that, at least with regard to the physical world, everything has an explanation. You know, everything has an explanation, and you can know it, and you can learn how to do it, and you can succeed at doing it. He didn't say it quite that way, but that was the gist of what he said. And so my interest, oh, you can stand up there. My interest is in understanding the physical world,
Okay.
but for people who want to understand those other worlds, they can do that. But my interest is in understanding the physical world and bringing rationality, at least at my level of interaction with that. Yes.
All right. That makes a lot of sense, and it seems that a lot of our guests have had strong interactions at an early age that made them like science. So I guess another question that I would have to kind of help the audience see how the world around you shaped you. Can you describe your education and kind of describe what was going on around the history of the time that you were in? So you grew up around the age of the civil rights movement, but at the same time, you were attending university, school at various ages. You probably grew up facing a lot of the vicissitudes of the Jim Crow South. So can you go into how those two forces, education, but also segregation, shaped you?
Well, believe it or not, segregation played a very small part. One reason is that for those of you who have an interest in history, if you read about the creation of Petersburg, Virginia, there has always been a majority of blacks who live there. And if you look at, if you go out 50 miles, there are 5 historically black educational institutions. There's Virginia State, there's Hampton, Norfolk State, Union, whatever else. Make up one, you can make that the 5th one. And so there were always a large number of educated uh, Negroes or colored people. That's what we called ourselves in those days.
Right.
Um, and so that was never an issue for most of us, or many of us who interacted with the educational system of any, that you can't do this, because we saw people from the beginning who were not only educated, but who were also creative. You know, not that there weren't lots of other people who were not in that situation. And so segregation in a real sense, the way most people look at it, didn't affect us directly. Uh, Within the community, we had many of our own services that were provided by Black people. I mean, even though we didn't have but 3 or 4 Black doctors, we did have Black doctors. And up until about 19, oh, probably 60, there was only one hospital that Blacks couldn't go to. And so we relied a lot on our own internal community people to help us out. But then, one thing I like, as I said, I don't consider myself per se a scientist or a physicist or mathematician. I'm interested in everything. We live in one single universe. And so the separation into disciplines, as we now call them, is a convenient for human beings who don't really have an interest in learning about a lot of things, you know. Uh, so I was surrounded by people and in the community and in a community where the ability to think clearly, to be rational was appreciated. But also in that community was the understanding that not everybody should go to college. When you have limited funds, not everybody can do everything. Now, the fortunate thing about Petersburg that helped with that way of thinking was that there was a military base nearby. There was a institute for, I've forgotten what they called it, but it was for crazy Negroes, rental institution. uh, there was Brown and Williams. They're all, but the point I'm trying to make is that there were places where if you did not go to college, and most people didn't, then there were jobs, even though they were menial and so forth, there were still jobs. And many Blacks across the country did not live in situations that allowed uh, for the not only to have most people who wanted jobs to have jobs, but just that interesting mix of people. For those of you who have lived in cities where there are military bases, then you know that the whole white-black thing is much different because you have Negroes running around with the possibility of guns. And so I'm not saying that you
Mm.
did not have segregation. You did not have, uh, you know, the kind of discrimination, but one could not necessarily have to deal with that on a regular individual basis that many folks have done or had to do.
I understand. So there was the military in a way provided an equalizer to some extent.
Well, what I'm saying is that in Petersburg, you had the big military base there. It's still there, by the way. You had you had three or four major companies. I mean, Brown and Williams packaged to, uh, cigarettes. So there were jobs there for people who wanted. And historically, Petersburg played a very important role in the economy of Virginia. We're very close to the Atlantic Ocean, the coast. Hope, uh, you had Hopewell, who had a very large chemical plant there, and that makes a difference. It's one thing if you have the possibility of, let's say, going work in Hopewell at the company there, or if you could work at the Negro Insane Asylum, as opposed to going down to a farm. I mean, if you know anything about the geography of Virginia, it's really three or four different kinds of geography. And the economic base of Virginia in the region of Petersburg was mainly military and these institutions, state institutions or industrial institutions, where people not only got jobs, but they were relatively well paying, relatively for blacks. The fourth thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, you had, you know, four or five historically black colleges in the immediate neighborhood. And in my hometown was Virginia State College. And on the staff at one time, I know when I was in high school, there were at least two or three blacks with PhDs in physics who were teaching there. So, but this has been the case for me throughout my life. I think I have been very lucky. And I have taken advantage of that luck. But one of the other things I believe that has helped me is that I have, excuse my language, but I'm going to use it anyway. Sometimes in life, you just have to not pay attention to shit. If people know that they can upset you, that they can prevent you from doing something, all they have to do is tweak you every single day. You have to pick your battles very carefully. You want to win. Most people want to make a point. No, you make a point only if you win the battle that you engaged in.
Okay, I understand. So, okay, that makes sense. Could you speak to I guess on the tail end of that question, that transition from Vanderbilt to the MIT postdoc?
Well, let's talk about Vanderbilt first.
Sure.
Well, I, one is when I was, Vanderbilt and Fisk are in the same town, Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
When I was a student at Fisk, I took courses at Vanderbilt University as an undergraduate. I'd always sit up on the front row, and I'd always make sure that I was heard and that what I said was rational and to the point. So I didn't have, I mean, think about it now. You think about Vanderbilt University in the South and everything that I went there in 1964, you would think, oh, in other places they were shooting each other and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Uh, when I was a student at Vanderbilt University, I think that a certain reputation had preceded me. And I don't want to go into it because it also involves possibly some illegal activities. But anyway,
Okay.
uh, but when I graduated from Fisk, and Fisk was the best institution. I mean, I think that when I left Fisk, I could have gone any place and succeeded in graduate school. But when I left Fisk, I had a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship for 1 year, and I had a Danford Fellowship for 4 years.
Right.
And so I had no problem. Oh, and the school itself gave me money.
Right.
I didn't take their money. I had my, and so uh, my advisor, Wendell Holliday, and I had met him when I was an undergraduate at Fisk. He told me, he says, look, because there was a lot of civil rights activity going on in Nashville in the 60s. He
Okay.
just says, I want you to do physics. Anything else, you don't have to tell me about. And that's what I did. I did physics, and I interacted strongly with all segments of the community over there, faculty, students, and this was on both an intellectual and a social level. But
Mhm.
I went there. I didn't have any. I didn't have any doubts about myself succeeding. And when events arose that might be, let's say, discouraging to some other people, they didn't discourage me. I dealt with them on the spot.
Mm. Could you could you elaborate on what you dealt with on the spot?
Oh, I don't think that's needed. I mean, I don't think it's of that great value
Okay.
to. I don't think it will help anyone to know that. And
Okay.
besides, one shouldn't talk about everything that has happened to them because some of this stuff will even now put you in jail.
Understood.
No,
So,
people, the thing is though, I mean, I find it amusing when people want to bare their soul and talk about all the stuff that people have done to them. Well, they didn't kill them. I mean, not that I'm saying they should have, but all I'm trying to say is that doesn't, I'm not that kind of person. That kind of thing of bearing my soul and woe is me and all that, you know,
okay.
that doesn't do any good for me.
Understood. So you kind of
And
have a different
besides,
attitude towards
let me
this.
just say this, and besides, if there's anyone who needs to get some words of wisdom from me, they're in bad shape. Just look, I mean, they're going to listen to me. That's not a good idea to listen to me.
Well, we definitely want to hear your opinion. So tell me a little bit about that transition to MIT and how was that?
Well, in 19, remember now, I had 4 years of support. One
Right.
year Woodrow Wilson, three. And remember, this is also during the Vietnam War.
Right.
During the Vietnam War, this lasted up to 68 when I was there. I got 7 induction notices to be inducted. They were very simple, single page. Dear Mickens, that's what it said. Never called me, but you are to report on, let's say, August the 5th to the post office of Petersburg, Virginia at 6 a.m. to be inducted into the military of the United States. Well, I never went. So that meant I must have been very clever about doing it. I don't want to go into the details of that because that's a long story in and of itself. Uh, but in 1968, the spring of 68, uh, I was awarded a National Science Foundation postdoc. And I think that it certainly was the first one in the physics department at the university. It might have been the first. And so my advisor was all proud and everything. But I was looking at the Vietnam War. I didn't want to go to the Vietnam. I wanted to spend a couple of more years in graduate school. I mean, I had finished my dissertation, not to go to the war. And he told me, well, if you don't go, then I'm dropping you as an advisor. So you either get your degree and leave.
Okay.
So all I did was I said, okay, backtrack. Okay, I'm leaving. I'm going to take up this postdoc at MIT. Um, and so that's how I got there. I mean, MIT in and of itself was not that impressive to me because, uh, in a real sense, I am self-sufficient, you know, and I don't need to get any kudos because I have been at a particular place. Remember, it's not where you've been, it's what you've been doing, you know. And so I got there. I just found it interesting. I got there, and like I said, I had published, I think, 11 papers when I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. Uh, And I just continued. I mean, I had an office up in the Theory Center, and I met and I knew all the people there. But from a fundamental point of view, I had no interest in what they were working on. And so I just continued to work on what I wanted to work on. And I participated in all of their activities. Every lunchtime, the members of the Theory Center would gather in one of the conference rooms. Most of the faculty members had kindergarten kiddie lunch pails. I mean, every, you know, I would just bring my sandwich, pull it out of my back pocket.
Right.
But, yeah. But now it was an interesting stay. I was there for 2 years. Then after leaving for a year, I went back as a visiting professor. But it was just interesting uh, seeing the dynamics of how people looked at each other and treated each other. In some sense, it was almost like kindergarten.
Okay.
Sort of, you know, that, but I had fun.
Okay.
I met people like Shirley Jackson. She had just, remember, I went there in 68. She became a graduate student in physics in 68. Jim Young.
Mhm.
Did you read my essay on Jim Young?
I
I,
haven't gotten to your essay on Jim Young. Sakazi Matingwa mentioned that you were great friends with James Young, though.
oh, we were buddies, let's say. We were
Right.
buddies in crime,
Right.
you know.
And then his students, he had a student, Jim Gates.
I knew Jim when he was there.
Right. So I guess that's a great transition. Thanks for bringing that up to a question I had. So you obviously had this small milieu of black physicists at MIT at the time.
Well,
Um,
let me just interrupt you.
Go ahead.
At the time I was there were, if you call me pseudo faculty, there were at least two other people. Jim Young, that first year, was visiting professor, and he became permanent. And there was a fellow named Charlie Grant.
Hmm.
He considered himself, he was from Panama. So there were three of us in the physics department, and we became very close.
Okay, wow. I've never heard of Charlie Grant. I'll have to read more on that. But I guess the question I was gonna ask is, um, so you have this milieu of black scientists, maybe larger than I expected, which is great. But what has been your experience in kind of building the next generation of black mathematicians and physicists through institutions or organizations like CARMS, which for those who don't know is the Conference for African American Researchers in the Mathematical Sciences, NSBP, as we're here right now doing an NSBP interview. Well, how did
Mm-hmm.
those organizations form and what was your involvement in all of that?
Well, let me give you my version of the history of the formation of the
Mhm.
National Society of Black Physicists. It's my version because I was there. In 1972, uh, Jim Young and I, along with Harry Larson, but primarily Jim Young and I discussed, we thought it would be a good idea if the Black physics community would get together and honor our ancestors. That is, those small group of people who were the first. There were people like Eagleson and Howard, like Hunter at um, Virginia State. Uh, and so what Jim and I did, I was at FISC, we organized in 1972 a day of what we call, well, it wasn't called scientific lectures, but it was basically a day to honor three of our ancestors who were still living.
Mhm.
And that's what we did. And there were over 50 Black physicists who attended that meeting at Fisk. Now, in 1974, we thought it would be a good idea. Again, this is basically Jim Young, myself, Harry Morrison, Warren Henry at Howard. And we had a second dinner at Howard University. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, there were a series of conferences that were held at Morehouse College. Carl Spike was one of the big people in organizing that. He was a professor. Okay? Now, at the meeting at Morgan, I think it was, 1977 or whatever.
Could be Morgan State 1977 right now.
Yes. It was decided to form an organization, a formal organization, which, by the way, I was opposed to, and I am still opposed to.
Mm.
We don't have enough time for me to explain why. But the organization was formed, and I participated in it. But do you know, for example, of the National Conference of Physics Students?
National Conference of Physics Students. It sounds familiar, but
That organization was started by Cynthia McIntyre. Do you know Cynthia McIntyre?
right. I've heard of Dr. McIntyre, yes.
And then there were people, and it was extremely successful.
Right.
It was a student based organization, and typically of the order of 150 to 200 students. But there were members in the latter part of the 20th century who destroyed, that is, members of the National Conference of Black Physicists who destroyed that organization.
Mm.
That's why I do not attend. I have not been to a single meeting of the National Society of Black Physicists since, I think, 1999. But again, it would take too much time to explain why I am saying the things that I am saying. But there are people out there who know this history. Okay.
So I thanks for that explanation. I guess one thing I would say and wonder about is um how have the presence of mathematicians and physicists changed in the Black community? And do you know of any methodology that could be done to retain said people in the field?
Oh, I think we certainly know. I mean, there are some programs that have been very successful. There was a program at MIT that Jim Young, Earl Loman, that ran for about, I don't know, 7 years. That's how Ron McNair got to MIT. There was a program that was set up that involved MIT, Fisk, Virginia State, Norfolk State, Hampton, and Alabama A&M. The idea would be you bring up students in their junior year and you put them into the MIT. They're taking the same courses as everybody else, pass fail. Now, at that time, the first year at MIT was pass fail anyway. And at the end of the year, you say, all right, this is the MIT experience. We're not changing anything for you, but do you think you want this experience? But this is what we did. You know, we got, for example, for people in physics, we got all the qualifying exams that had been given. We got as many exams that had been given in the courses and so forth. We set up study rooms. You know, you will succeed if you bring in a cohort of students. Bringing in one or two students is not going to work. You need to have enough students so that you can have a good pod. You need to bring in about 10 students, let's say, per year, and they'll succeed. I mean, their success has nothing to do with their abilities. When you bring one student in, then that student has to unless they have a strong personality and very self-sure, they're not going to be able to get into uh, study groups, things of that sort. You bring in enough students, you know, and you also need do like the people do in what do you call it, hockey. You know what a bruiser is? This is
No,
somebody
I'm not so sure.
whose sole function is to kick ass. You know,
Right.
they don't make any points. We just don't. And you need a variety. But the thing is, we know how. There was a program at Stanford for a number of years
Mm,
that were. There's the Bell Laboratory program.
right.
It's now out of business. There was a program, Prism D, at Clark Atlanta University. Uh, the Navy funded that program for 15 years. And I think out of that program, a couple of hundred students got PhDs, but not just in physics. So it's well known, I think, how to make these things successful. And one of the things, if you want to fail at it, is bring in one or two students at a time. You need to bring in enough students so that they can have a critical mass, and so that if one or two students graduate, you're not down to zero again. That you have institutional memory as to how to succeed and so forth. Yeah,
That makes sense.
by the way, I just got through with some knee surgery, and one of the consequences, my mouth is very dry. And so if I sound like I'm stumbling, it's because my mouth is dry.
No, you're totally fine. But
Okay.
thanks for that. Okay, so you're basically your suggestion is to get a critical mass of Black students attending these spaces
Each,
and these
yeah,
institutions, and then
every program that has succeeded.
right.
Now, the unfortunate thing is this: for each of those programs, let's say the one at MIT, the one out of Stanford, while the departments bought into it in terms of allowing that to happen, very few faculty did. And so when faculty leave, I mean, if you have a small number of faculty who are willing to work with these students, put them in their labs or do theory with them, when they leave or they die, in a very short time, the program will die out. And that is what has happened to all those programs.
Right. As far as I understand, I mean, Stanford has a good amount of Black students in the PhD program, but they had a great amount with Arthur B.C. Walker Jr.
Right, right.
and to the
But
point that
they,
they outpaced Howard.
yeah. But the thing is, they don't have to necessarily be black faculty. At
Mm,
MIT, it was what I'm trying to think of what's the astronaut? Ron McNair, his advisor.
okay.
I mean, you know, you need at least, I would say, you need at least 3 or 4 faculty, and then they can recruit other faculty.
Okay.
I mean, it would
Understood.
be good to have black faculty. Look, the reality is, how many places have 4 or 5 black faculty in black schools? No, none of them do. So, you know, that's, as they say, aspirational goal. But that's not going to work. We need to, I think, go back to the things we know will work, and that is bringing in enough students. If let's suppose you brought in 5 students a year, and let's say your PhD program is 4 or 5 years. That means at equilibrium you have about 20 students there.
Mm,
See, you have 4
right.
the first year, you have 8 the second year. Yeah, and that's what's needed. And
Right.
it doing it also provides this community, because I know when I went back to MIT in '72 as visiting professor, we I set up a course for all the Black graduate students who wanted to come. They didn't necessarily have to. I mean, it was an official course at MIT. We met every Friday, and I believe it was from 4 to 5 or 5:30. And then, and so the graduate students and our Black faculty would come together. Someone would make a presentation. I mean, we're treated like This is like a regular course, like a regular seminar. And then afterwards, I would treat everyone to Chinese meal. That's when things were cheaper.
Right.
And we'd get, maybe 25, 30 students to come.
Mm.
And for those who could later on, they wanted to continue, I would go over to my house. I lived between MIT and Harvard. You know, it's the social, it's the social aspect, the community that can be formed that is missing in many of these. And we would, after a while, we started to have non-Black students attend the seminar and come to my party, which is good.
Okay.
So, very few people will give up something that is good if it will help them. I
Mm.
mean, they may steal it from you, but I mean, so, I tell my graduate students, when I had graduate students, always work on 3 or 4 ideas. Make sure you have some idea that you want someone to steal. Just go ahead and steal it. I got more. you know,
Okay. Understood.
you want
So
you want to be stealable,
yeah,
but
it has to be worth something.
it has to be worth something. Yes.
Okay. Understood. Okay. So that kind of covers one question I was going to ask that was more along the lines of advice for um Black students. But I guess one thing I wanted to ask you before we start taking some questions from the audience, they can, give things in Q&A or if they'd
Mhm.
like. But one thing I'd like to ask is, what do you think is your most seminal work, and what are you most excited for in the future of physics research?
Well, my most seminal work is that I have 2 kids who have done well. My daughter's dissertation from Boston University is published by um, New York University Press. My son is professor of computer science at Harvard. My wife, who also has a PhD, has basically been jobless, but devoted all of her time to her kids and her community. Now, the research that I have done myself, uh, well, I've done a lot of things. I have almost 400 publications. What
Right.
I do is I work on what I'm interested in. It's like eating pie. You don't gain any good sensation from looking at other people eat pie. You eat it. So I enjoy what I do. But there are 2 or 3 things that I have created. For example, I created the field of so-called non-standard finite difference equations.
Mm.
And I have, I think, a couple of books out on it and 3 or 4 edited volumes where people have used their work. But, you know, uh, look, if there's anyone that's interested in what I've done, it's very easy. All you have to do is Google Ronald E. Mickens. My son may come up, you know, and there's thousands of pages of material on what I've done. You know, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, that's the best word. That's all I want to say about it. But I have enjoyed what I've done. And to me, that's the most important thing. I have I've published and or edited 22 books, and my next book is coming out in May. It's called, what is it called? I should know the title of it. Qualitative Methods for Differential Equations.
Okay.
And this book, 2 books ago, this is called Generalized Trigonometric and Hyperbolic Functions. But I have generally worked on what I have enjoyed. And I have also tried to be honest with other people out there. I mean, let me just give you one of my more, I wouldn't call it philosophical, but let's say metaphysical topics. People always say that mathematics is the language of science. That's not true. That's not true. It is good, and it is a very good approximation. But mathematics cannot be the pure language of science. Why? Because all measurements are discrete. You will
Okay.
never measure something with an infinite number of decimal points. Every decimal point you increase in your measurement, you have to add energy to it. So in order to let's say if you were experimentally going to measure pi, it would require infinite time and infinite. So mathematics, the current mathematical structures that we use, are very good approximation, but there's no such thing as a final. And so, we start with simple examples, and then we increase the complexity of the mathematics, then increase it. But there's nothing to say that there might be some other logical, abstract structure out there that does not coincide exactly with mathematics that can be used to represent portions of the physical world.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah,
That's a unique perspective. Thanks so much for that. And so we have one question from the audience,
yes.
and it's from Dr. Roscoe Giles, and he says, "Thanks, Ron. Great hearing you talk about this history. What do you think of current student groups and access to the physics community?"
Well, we live in interesting times. The Chinese curse, may your life be interesting. That's actually a curse. But we also live in very confusing times. If you look at what happened, let's say a decade ago, and compare it to now, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we thought that we were at the apex. There were people that were setting up DEI programs. They were doing all this. And now all of this seems to be, at least at the level of funding at the national level and at the university, being destroyed. Now, let me give you my honest opinion. I think that the DEI people went overboard. I personally, when you set up laws, those laws are set up by people who are currently in power. So you know where I'm going with this. That means that when you change who's in power, the laws can change. What needs to be done is to think clearly about how we should proceed, because we don't want to have, and I hate to use this word, progress, however limited it is, based on who's in power. We want these things to extend. And I think one of the reasons why the Democrats lost is that they didn't listen to a lot of people who said, I don't like this, or I don't like that, and so forth. These people vote, even if they have to vote against their own interests. You know. But related to it is that, the whole Western world is in turmoil. The Western world is actually going through a period of decline. And I think, now see, at one time we identified the Western world as so-called Europeans or white people. I don't use that expression. I use the power structure, because there are a lot of people who are not Europeans or white people who buy into it. And it's very clear that the economic structure of the world is changing drastically, that the social structures are changing drastically, that there are people all over the world who do not want to live under their present conditions, both socially, economically, and intellectually. And we have to figure out some way of, when we make changes, to ensure that they last. Now, it may be that's an impossibility, you know. But look at the major universities, places like Harvard, blah, blah, blah. You know, Colombia, you know, they're, they have completely flipped the switch on what is now considered to be appropriate at a university than it was a decade or even 5 years ago. And we're caught in the middle. We're caught in the middle. You know, we think that just if we say certain things and we say it in the right way, that everybody is going to agree with us. That's not true. That's not true. And and we have to solve that problem. But I'm not sure that it's solved. You know, I mean,
Okay.
one thing that is clear recently is that, you know, the golden rule: he who has the gold rules, or better, he who's in power. Yeah, we're seeing that that in a matter of minutes, hours, or days, that things that we wish about, we, I'm talking now about Black people in general. And so this is going to affect things like graduates. Can you hear that noise?
There's
Is
a
it
little bit of noise in the background,
okay? Yeah,
but okay.
yeah. But say hello to my friend there in this question. I haven't seen him. We haven't seen each other in decades.
Right. There's another question right now from David Gribble, and he said, "Thanks for the interview, Ron. You're a real inspiration. I've been thinking Edward Boucher's story always seems to get presented as a great tragedy because his opportunities to influence the field were so limited. Do you know if he ever crossed paths with people like Imes, Halson Eagleson, John Hunter, etc.? And if so, what is the likelihood that those encounters, even if brief, had a profound influence on them?"
Uh, as far as I know, the answer is no. I mean, he was a grown man when they were children, you know. So, and he died in what is it, 1918, something like that. So, yeah. But I don't look at him as being tragic. I think, first of all, that most people don't understand how he got to be where he was. You remember that his father worked at Yale as a so-called sweeper. Nowadays, we would call them maintenance man or janitors. Okay? I'll give you my story of how I think he, how Boucher got to Hopkins Grammar School. I think it was an experiment. Now I'm giving you Mickens' version. You know, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree. If you disagree, don't be sending me emails. I'm not going to read it anyway. No, but I think that it was an experiment. That there was this person who was connected, his father at Yale, and people, and I'm sure his father talked about his son often. And so I think someone at Hopkins, and possibly at Yale, they have a very close connection, decided that's just okay. People are talking about Negroes as being inferior. Another group, Negroes, saying that Negroes are not inferior. Let's just do an experiment and see what happens. Okay. And I think that's what. Now, when he got to Yale, he succeeded. When he finished Yale in 1874, he was approached by one of the overseers of the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. And they made him a deal. They said that if he would spend another couple of years, get his PhD, which was relatively rare during the time, you know, that they would pay for it, but he would have to teach at the Institute for Colored Youth. Now, I'm certain that he and his family had no money that would allow him to be at Yale Graduate School. And so he took it. And he went to the Institute for Colored Youth and he succeeded there. But he was a rebel there. There's actually lots of material on Boucher, uh, and that was I was notified about 30 years ago by colleague of mine, Linda Perkins. I believe she's a sociologist, and she did a dissertation on the woman who was head principal or whatever they call. But Boucher was always asking for money for his laboratories. You know, he was always, you know, uh, trying to increase the salaries of the people there. He was very active in his community. He went out and tried to help members of the community who wished to read and write things of that sort. And when the great debate between Washington and Du Bois broke out, the overseers, who were Quakers, by the way, of the Institute for Colored Youth, closed the school down. And they moved it out into the country to be the foundation of what's now called Cheney College or Cheney University. The people at Cheney ought to be ashamed of themselves talking about they're the first historically Black college and university. They weren't the first. They grew out of the Institute for Colored Youth. Now, Boucher, when you look into the records, you find when they closed the Institute down, Boucher was the only person who was not given extra money, severance pay. He was the only one. And that was because of his belief in education, but at a high level, at a high level. So
Right.
I've actually forgotten what question you asked, but I
Right.
hope I answered it.
No, I think that gives a very good um answer to the question that
Oh,
David.
let me say one other thing, and this is important.
Sure.
One of the when Boucher was out of position, a faculty position, he wrote to Hampton University. Now, of course, now Hampton University was the home of Washington. They turned him down. I have a copy of that letter. It's just 2 or 3 lines. They turned him down. Um, I think he also wrote to Tuskegee. I may be wrong about that. But point I want to make, and this is interesting, he also applied to Yale University for a position. And his professor, one of his professors who was at Yale, agreed that he could satisfy the position, the requirements for the position. He didn't get it, obviously. And I have a copy of that. That's on record. That's an application form. I guess it's an evaluation form. And that professor, and the professor's name was Arthur Wright. That's the person that I'm almost certain he did his PhD under. You know. Now I don't know what the motivation of Wright was, whether he, but I think he probably knew in his heart that there was no way he was going to get the position. Boucher. Yeah.
Well, that is a really interesting history. I wish we could really discuss more on Boucher specifically at some point, but you are a very prolific writer on the history of Black physicists and mathematicians, and your writing is all over the internet, like you've said, and AIP and these sorts of organizations. So the audience can definitely look at that if they'd like. And
But
I wanna
let me make one comment about history.
sure.
History is not about what happened. History is about what the writer wants you to think happened,
Yeah.
you know, because there are no such thing as facts. There are documents. And from documents, based on some methodology, you create a narrative, a set of facts. But different people, because they use different narratives and different methodologies, can create alternative histories. And we see this all the time. You may look, for example, at the origins of the Civil War. You get different ways of interpreting it. But I will shut up because you're trying to get off.
Oh no, I mean, we could listen to you all day. But
But you won't.
no, I so we definitely appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much on behalf of NSBP.
Okay.
And I always enjoy having these conversations and listening or reading anything you put out. So thank you so much for being our first Black History Month interviewee for 2025. And we hope that the audience will tune in for the next couple of segments we have. Please keep in touch with our social media pages as we're advancing the legacies of Black physicists and highlighting those all month. And thank you for watching.